All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. And today we're going to be looking into someone whose name I'm sure you've heard before, even well into the 21st century. She continues to be, well, a bit of a lightning rod, Ayn Rand and her philosophy. But it's not just the ideas themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting because with Rand, you're not just dealing with the philosopher in the traditional academic sense. She really was a novelist philosopher, and I mean that in the most literal way. Her entire philosophical system, which she called Objectivism, it's not like she developed that in some ivory tower separate from her creative work. It's woven directly into the narratives, into her characters, her novels, short stories, even her plays, her screenplays. You can think of them almost like living thought experiments for her ideas.
I mean, that's a really good point, especially when you consider her early career. It's not like these ideas that she became so known for were just immediately accepted.
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, her very first novel, We the Living, which came out in 1936, it's a really powerful semi-autobiographical story set in Soviet Russia, and it actually faced a ton of rejections before it finally got published. You had to consider the intellectual climate back then, the kind of, I don't know, maybe even romanticism in some circles, surrounding the idea of the Soviet experiment. I mean, Rand's portrayal was highly critical. She definitely wasn't afraid to go against the grain.
Which, knowing her later work and her absolute rejection of any form of collectivism, makes a lot of sense. Then, in 1938, we get Anthem, that dystopian novella that seems to really foreshadow a lot of those core themes that she explores so deeply in her later work. What do you see in Anthem that maybe hints at where her mature philosophy was headed?
Well, Anthem is crucial for a lot of reasons, but one of the big ones is how she explores that tension, the tension between the individual I and the crushing weight of the collective, the we. It really highlights, even in those early stages, how important the concept of individual identity was to her and the dangers she saw in any kind of society that tries to erase that. Rand herself even described Anthem as a kind of, well, a palate cleanser, a shorter work that allowed her to dive into what became a much more ambitious project. You know what I'm talking about, right?
The Fountainhead,
Yeah.
published in 1943. That one, it really feels like a turning point in her career.
Oh, without a doubt. And again, it wasn't an instant success. She faced rejections. The initial reception from critics was mixed, to say the least. But then something really interesting happened. The public, they latched onto this book. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. What was it about The Fountainhead that you think really resonated so deeply?
It's a good question. I think it was partly the timing. You have to remember, this is a post-war world, grappling with all these huge questions about conformity, about collectivism, about the individual's place in society. And then you have Howard Rourke, this uncompromising individualist who refuses to bend his vision to anyone else's will. He just embodied this, I don't know, this passionate defense of a certain way of being in the world that clearly struck a chord.
Totally. And I think it's important to remember that Rand wasn't just telling a story. This was a deeply philosophical novel. It laid out, in a very dramatic way, a lot of her core ideas about individualism, about the creative spirit, about the role of reason in human life. And then after the success of The Fountainhead, she kind of doubled down on those themes on that scale. And that brings us to, well,
Atlas Shrugged, that behemoth of a novel that came out in 1957. For a lot of people, it really represents the most complete articulation of her philosophical vision.
I think that's fair to say. It was more than just a novel. It was like a philosophical treatise wrapped up in this dramatic narrative. The sheer scope of it, the way it integrated her ideas about, everything. We're talking metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, economics. You name it. It's all there in Atlas Shrugged. It really solidified her status as this major and, yes, very controversial intellectual force.
And at that point, it's not just her books. We see the formation of a full-blown philosophical movement. Talk to me about the development of Objectivism in 1958.
Well, it makes sense, right? After the immense success of Atlas Shrugged, you had this whole readership who were hungry for more. They wanted a deeper, more systematic way to understand and discuss her ideas. So the formation of the Objectivist movement, which she actually started with Nathaniel Branden, it was a direct response to that demand. They established journals, the Objectivist newsletter, that kind of thing, lecture courses. It was an attempt to move beyond just the fictional presentation and really systematize her philosophy.
Okay, so we have this incredibly popular author, the development of a dedicated philosophical movement. It all seems to be coming together. But here's where things get a little, well, complicated. Because despite her popularity, her widespread readership, the academic world, the professional philosophers, they haven't really embraced her work in the same way. Why do you think that is? What are some of the reasons for that kind of disconnect?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and it's one that's been debated for decades.
Mhm.
There are a few key factors at play here. First, her writing style. It's incredibly engaging for a general audience, but within academic philosophy, it's often seen as, well, maybe a little too polemical, not quite as rigorous in terms of argumentation and engagement with, the history of philosophical thought. And then there is her tone. She was very sharp, often quite dismissive of other philosophical traditions, which probably didn't help foster a spirit of open dialogue.
I can see that. It's hard to have a productive philosophical conversation if there's this sense of, I don't know, a lack of intellectual charity.
Exactly. And then to make matters more complex, you had some of her most ardent fans. Their enthusiasm sometimes bordered on, I don't want to say dogma, but you know what I mean. And that created this perception within academia that engaging with her ideas might just lead to these unproductive clashes rather than genuine philosophical inquiry.
Right. And it's not just the style and the tone, there's also the format. Her heavy reliance on fiction to present her ideas, it's not exactly the standard mode of philosophical discourse.
No, it's definitely unusual. In academic philosophy, there's a real emphasis on explicit, non-narrative argumentation. And so when you have these complex philosophical concepts embedded within a novel, it raises questions about testability, about the precise formulation of the arguments. It can be hard to disentangle the philosophy from the story, which can be frustrating for academics who are looking for that clear, systematic presentation.
And then, of course, there's her relationship with the history of philosophy. It's been pointed out that her engagement with previous thinkers wasn't always the most, let's say, thorough. She could be pretty quick to dismiss entire schools of thought, which doesn't sit well with those who see philosophy as this ongoing dialogue across centuries.
I mean, yeah, you could definitely say that she had a certain boldness in her pronouncements. And to be fair, that directness, that willingness to challenge established ideas, it's part of what drew people to her work. But within academia, there's a real value placed on nuanced engagement with the history of philosophical debates. So that approach, it maybe didn't win her a ton of fans in those circles. Although even some philosophers who are very critical of her methodology or specific arguments, they do acknowledge that she raised some genuinely interesting and important questions.
So with all that said, we have this really interesting situation, this philosopher with huge popular influence, but at least in some circles, limited academic acceptance. What's our mission today? What do we want our listeners to take away from this deep dive into Ayn Rand?
Our goal today is to really distill the core philosophical tenets of objectivism, to extract those essential ideas that form the foundation of her worldview, and to present them to you in a clear, accessible way. We're going to be drawing from both her nonfiction essays and the implicit philosophical framework embedded in her novels. Because ultimately, whether or not her work is fully embraced within academic circles, her influence is undeniable. And I think understanding the core of her system is crucial for understanding that impact.
Okay, so let's get to that core. What are the, let's say, the non-negotiables of Ayn Rand's philosophy? If you had to boil it down, what are the key takeaways?
Okay, so objectivism, at its very foundation, it rests on a specific understanding of reality, human nature, and morality. And I think the best way to encapsulate that is with Rand's own words. She described her philosophy as the concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. Now, each of those elements, they carry a lot of weight within her system.
Man as a heroic being. That's a striking phrase, and maybe even a little bit provocative. What does that heroism actually mean in Rand's view?
Yeah, it's not quite the traditional capes and tights kind of heroism. For Rand, being heroic, it's about the individual's capacity for independent thought, for productive achievement. It's about pursuing your own values, your own happiness, with unwavering commitment. It's a celebration of human potential and a rejection of any moral system that says you should sacrifice yourself for others. Instead, she puts individual happiness front and center, not as some afterthought, but as the fundamental ethical imperative. Your own flourishing, that's the goal.
Interesting. And then there's the idea of productive achievement as his noblest activity.
Right.
So it's not just about work, it's about a very specific kind of work. What's so special about productive achievement in this context?
Right. So for Rand, productive, it doesn't just mean any kind of labor. It specifically refers to creating value, either material or intellectual, through your own effort and ability. It's about bringing something new into the world. It could be a physical product, a work of art, a scientific discovery, a business, anything that transforms resources and ideas into something of value. That act of creation, that's what Rand saw as essential to human flourishing. It's how we express ourselves, how we gain self-esteem, how we find genuine happiness.
So it's not just about working hard, it's about creating, about using your mind to shape the world around you. And then finally, there's this emphasis on reason as his only absolute. This really seems to underscore just how central rationality is to objectivism. How did Rand define reason?
Well, for Rand, reason is the bedrock. It's the fundamental tool of human cognition. It's how we acquire knowledge, how we understand the world, how we make sense of things. She saw reason as, in a very literal sense, our primary means of survival. Because without reason, we're left relying on things like faith, intuition, emotion detached from logic, or just blindly following external authorities. And for Rand, that's a rejection of what makes us uniquely human. It's a path that leads to error, to destruction, to all sorts of problems. Reason, in this context, it's about logic, it's about evidence, it's about that commitment to objective truth.
So we have this philosophy that's deeply individualistic, that champions achievement, that puts reason at the center of everything. And all of that has some very clear implications for how Rand viewed politics and economics, most notably her really strong advocacy for laissez-faire capitalism.
Yeah.
What's the connection there?
Well, Rand argued that laissez-faire capitalism, which she saw as a system characterized by minimal government intervention, free markets, and a strong emphasis on individual rights, particularly property rights, she argued that this was the only system that truly aligned with objectivism. Why? Because, in her view, it was the only system that respected the individual as an end in themselves. It allows individuals to pursue their own happiness, to achieve their potential through voluntary exchange and productive work. It doesn't force them to sacrifice themselves for some collective good or be subject to the arbitrary whims of the state.
So in this vision, the role of the government, it's pretty strictly limited.
Absolutely. For Rand, the only legitimate functions of government are those that protect individual rights. So we're talking about the right to life, liberty, and property. And how do you protect those rights? Well, you need a system of objective laws, you need a police force to enforce those laws, and you need national defense to protect against external threats. Anything beyond that, whether it's excessive taxation or social welfare programs, Rand saw that as a violation of individual rights. It's the government stepping outside its bounds and initiating force against its own citizens.
It's interesting because while her defense of a minimal state has become pretty influential in libertarian circles, Rand herself, she actually rejected that label. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a nuance that a lot of people miss. While there's definitely overlap between objectivism and libertarianism, especially in their shared emphasis on individual liberty and limited government, Rand had some pretty fundamental disagreements with the broader libertarian movement. For example, she was very much against anarchism, which she saw as, well, kind of naive. She believed that you need an objective legal system to protect individual rights, and that requires some form of government. And she also had philosophical differences on things like epistemology, how we know what we know, and ethics, which led her to, maintain that distinct identity for objectivism.
Okay, so just to recap, Ayn Rand presented this very comprehensive and often very challenging philosophy. It's centered on the heroic individual, achieving happiness through productive work, guided by reason, all within a political and economic framework of laissez-faire capitalism.
Exactly. And it's that whole interconnected system of thought that continues to generate so much discussion, so much debate. I mean, you either love her ideas or you hate them, but you definitely can't ignore them. She remains incredibly relevant to how we think about ethics, politics, even the nature of human existence itself.
Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive, and I think it really highlights why Ayn Rand's ideas, even if they're not universally accepted, have had such a lasting impact.
I agree. Her vision of the individual, the power of reason, it continues to be this potent force in our culture, for better or for worse.
Now, before we go, here's a final thought for you to consider. Ayn Rand believed that philosophy wasn't just some abstract academic exercise. She believed it had real practical implications for how we live our lives. And she argued that everyone, whether they realize it or not, operates based on some set of philosophical premises. So as you go about your day, think about this. Do you consciously choose your philosophical framework, or do you mostly just absorb it from the world around you? And how does that framework, whether it's deliberately chosen or passively adopted, how does it shape your pursuit of happiness, your approach to work, your interactions with others, your engagement with the world? What happens when certain philosophical ideas, whether they're about individual achievement or collective responsibility, rational inquiry, or faith, what happens when those ideas become dominant in a society? It's a question that pushes us to think deeply about what drives us both as individuals and as a collective.
It's a great question. And with that, I think we'll leave it there for today.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Until next time.